Welcome to the Birth Launch Podcast, an empowering space for expecting and new parents to hear candid conversations with experts and learn how to craft your ideal birth. We will tackle the scary and weird questions that come up along the way and provide answers that are driven by science and evidence-based recommendations. I'm going to show you how to redefine parenthood and choose what's best aligned for you and your goals. With 10 years of experience in family education and a master's degree in human development and family studies, I'm ready to help you navigate pregnancy and explore your birth options to free yourself of fear surrounding childbirth. My goal is to help you have an informed and confident labor experience, plus an empowered and joyous postpartum. Marlie, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, HeHe, for having me. I feel like it's been a long time coming, and I don't know, we've just been following each other for so long, so I'm just really happy to be here and chit-chat.
Absolutely. We're both in the New England area, and I think that a lot of the things that we each stand for overlap with one another's content and beliefs and the way that, we see the problems in the healthcare system, but we also are very hopeful that there are fixes that I think both of us believe like we can fix our healthcare system. It's going to take a lot, but we can do it. It's not doom and gloom that I think a lot of people do hold about the healthcare system. So yeah, I agree. A long time coming. I'm very excited for this conversation. I know that we get a lot of questions about litigation and legalities within the hospital system. And
Yeah.
obviously, I know what I've learned throughout the years, but I'm no expert in that. And so I really appreciate you coming and sharing your wisdom with our audience to help us understand kind of, where do the legal boundaries lie within the hospital and what are our rights as patients? And if we're not getting appropriate care, maybe that means unsafe. Maybe it just means not in alignment to us, not necessarily bad care. What steps do we have as patients? I think a place that I would really love to start is maybe what are some rights that we have as patients in the hospital system that maybe not are so obvious. Maybe they are things that you always hear people say, "Oh gosh, I didn't know I could do that. I didn't know I could decline that. I didn't know I could ask for that. I didn't know that was even an option for me."
Yeah, I think that, and just to kind of put some context in, I think there's a lot of misconception about the types of lawsuits that are brought in the birth injury world and in the birth trauma world, or just in this kind of obstetrical field. And I think that a part of me doing podcasts and a part of me talking about it is to kind of help understand, like, what are the lawsuits that are actually being filed, and are they things like allowing a mother to, ambulate while she's laboring, or, letting a mother eat intermittently during her labor? Like, those things just aren't popping up in lawsuits. And so, from my perspective, when I hear things like, well, I'm not going to lose my license over that, so you can't do that, or I'm not going to let you do this because my license is on the line. And when I hear that from either a client that has come to me, or even a nurse that might follow me because that's the information that she's been told, I feel that's when I just became like, okay, I need to come out and start talking that that's just not the reality. Those aren't the lawsuits that we're seeing. And also reminding people that the people that are building these policies and these procedures for the hospital, they're not really practicing medicine, right? They're risk managers. They're probably former lawyers or lawyers, in that kind of risk and safety world, versus practicing obstetrics, practicing midwives, practicing nurses with the benefit of this evidence-based medicine. And so that's kind of where I get frustrated, because the policies are really, as a lawyer, my job, and as a lawyer, everybody else's job, is to reduce risk of liability, right? And we are never going to eliminate liability. You can't,
Totally.
right? You're just never going to eliminate it. But what happens is the hospital people with all of the money, they like it when we can reduce as much risk as possible. So they're including just a wide range of policies and procedures and catch-alls. And it's like, just so that they can eliminate as much as possible. It's not that these things are really happening on a day-to-day basis. It's the same as if you and I go to a trampoline park with our child and we're signing a waiver. And if you look at that waiver, it has all of these potential outcomes and all of these things you can and can't do, and all of these things. And you're kind of trying to eliminate the possibility of the risk. But 9 times out of 10, you go there and nothing like that ever happens. So I think that there's just this misconception that because it's written in the policy, then that's something that is litigated frequently, and it's just not the case. And also, it's policies and procedures of the hospital. It's not necessarily a legal document that you are bound to as a patient. And I think that as a patient, it gets tricky to understand, am I legally bound to these policies and procedures? And the answer is no, you're not. Like, just because you're a laboring patient, just because you're pregnant, it doesn't exempt you from your legal right to make decisions about your treatment, about your medical care, about, refusing treatment, accepting treatment, and things of that nature. So just having that knowledge of, the policies and the procedures, that's not legally binding to you. There could be and there are risks to obviously not following those policies and procedures, but it's not that you are removed of your fundamental rights by just going into that hospital. So a perfect example is, when there's the situation about a C-section and the mom really doesn't want a C-section. And, I've heard providers say, well, I'm not losing my license over this, or you can find another provider. And the
Mm.
fact of the matter is, like, it's not legal. You can't turn away a person that's actively in labor. And so we've had patients that are actively in labor, refusing medical treatment, and these things are being said to them. And we have a law, that precludes doctors from saying that, precludes doctors from doing that. They have to treat a patient that's in active labor, regardless of whether the patient agrees with what their decisions for their care are.
Can a doctor or nurse just document that they educated the patient, they gave a clinical recommendation, the patient understood the risk and benefits, and they declined anyway? Isn't that enough? I mean, that is basic consent. I gave you the information, I gave you the free will to make your decision. You chose not to do what my clinical recommendation was, and I'm going to respect that. Is that not enough?
It is if it's done appropriately and documented appropriately, and the consent is valid, and the documentation of that consent is valid, and that's adequately available in the medical record, that there was a refusal of medical treatment and they've checked all these boxes. So what happens is insurance companies really terrify the providers by saying, like, you, even if you think you did it right, a lawyer might come and say, well, that consent wasn't valid because the patient didn't have the proper capacity, or what have you. So I think that doctors get a little bit nervous because of the way that the insurance companies make them feel that perhaps that's not enough. But there's very basic ways to make sure that informed refusal for medical treatment is valid and is going to withstand any sort of litigation, right? So things that the court wants to look at is the capacity of the patient at the time that the decision was made. So you want to make sure that the doctors are documenting that appropriately in the medical record, that she was conscious, that she was able to engage in a discussion, that she was not on any sort of medication that would alter her ability to have that discussion, that there was another witness in the room, whether it's a support person or a nurse or a doula or what have you, and that this discussion was an ongoing discussion, right? Because you and I both know that informed consent changes as the patient presentation changes, right? So it's not just a one time Oh, we got consent at the beginning of the labor, things can change in 12 hours. Things can change again 24 hours later. So the courts want to make sure that this was an ongoing conversation and that the conversation was documented at each point that potentially that patient's presentation had changed. And again, voluntary, right? So was this, courts also look and say, was this a voluntary decision from the patient? Was this free of coercion? Was this free of any sort of pressure? And the patient made that decision voluntarily. And if you have all of those boxes checked, and if you have them sign, there's a actual paperwork that
An
lays all of these
AMA.
things out correct.
Yeah.
um, but again, it's not just the piece of paper. So I just want to make sure that we're clear about that. It's not just the AMA piece of paper, because you have to make sure all of those other boxes are checked and that it's documented within that. So, you can have a boilerplate AMA that the patient and the doctor signs. If they don't have those other puzzle pieces in there and documented properly, not only in the AMA, but in the medical record, then there could be this risk of potential liability. But the other important thing to remember is that it depends on the severity of the risk that the patient is taking. Okay. So it's very different when we're talking about providers who are dismissing birth plans, that are dismissing a mom laboring in a specific position, telling them they can't do that. The risk of the patient or the baby getting injured for something like that is a lot lower than, let's say, a situation where a mom or a doctor believes that the baby might be in some sort of fetal distress and the patient is refusing a C-section based off of that. So do you see what I'm saying? Like the
Totally.
courts, yeah, so the courts will look at things like that and say, well, what was the potential risk of
Mhm.
the patient refusing this, or refusing the medical treatment, or refusing to follow the doctor's recommendations? Was it just a low risk, or was this potential of severe injury to either the mom or the baby? And so what we've found in with providers is they're treating it the same, right? And they're treating it the same as far as telling the patients that that's not an option. And so my kind of point is like, we really need to be picking and choosing our battles here, and being aware of what is actually at risk, and so that we can make the best possible experience and what is the right of the patient's experience, without the provider feeling like my authority is being
Question.
challenged,
Totally.
or my license is at risk, or even I'm subject to a lawsuit. you know, I can't sue a doctor unless there's an injury. And I think that that's another point that people, unfortunately, kind of, there's a myth with that. Like, it's actually sad how many people come to me with really horrible birth stories, really treated horribly, but they don't have any physical injury, or their baby doesn't have any physical injury. And unfortunately, our judicial system doesn't offer recourse for just simply being treated completely
Inhumane.
inappropriately, yeah,
Yeah.
inhumane, whatever you want to say. And that's a consequence of years and years and years of common law, and years and years and years of statutory law, where we don't value a woman's birth experience from the perspective of mental trauma. Even in my cases where there is a physical injury, it's very difficult to also tack on that mental trauma. And in my experience with my own clients, in some situations, the mental trauma is more debilitating than the physical injury that they received. And And so the fact that we don't in our court system acknowledge that appropriately leaves so many people traumatized by their birth experience without recourse, and it's shocking to them to learn that when I talk to them about it. But then that also makes me feel like, hey, providers, like these are easy fixes that you can be making to offer better birthing experiences for your patients without thinking that you're going to be sued on it. That's my whole point. It's like they are very worried about getting sued, so much so that they're willing to go against, a patient's autonomy. And in reality, the risk of liability in those situations is very low, exceedingly low.
But okay, so this is something I have always said, and it is a hill I will die on unless you change my mind today, then I'll give it up. There are so many times where if a provider would just be honest with a patient, they would reduce their liability. But because they took the autonomy from that patient and it ended in trauma, you just opened yourself up to so much liability because that patient now feels a lot of things, usually trauma and guilt and anger, and they feel taken advantage of and they feel lied to often. And some people even say, like, I feel abused, I feel violated. It's like really horrible things. That person is much more likely to open up litigation against you because of the way you made them feel, versus if you just had an honest conversation and say, look, we are stepping into some risky ground here. Things might go bad and they also might go well. And I want you to choose which one you want. I'm happy to support you in whatever, but I want you to know there are some serious risk here as we proceed. What do you want to do? I mean, it's a hill I'll die on. Like a lot of litigation is self-imposed by things that they chose to do in the birth room.
Yeah, in the birth room and then after as well. So a lot of
Oh,
in the sense of, I've had people call me only because nobody will answer their questions about what happened after their birth.
God.
That and so it's not just limited to how we're treating patients during the delivery. It's how we're treating patients after the delivery and answering the questions and debriefing with them and telling them, this wasn't your fault, and this was something that happened in this way, or this, explain the process to them. But they've been kind of, the system has brainwashed them to believe that doing that is not going to be beneficial, and it's going to open yourself up to further liability because you're going to be making statements about potentially your contribution to the injury. And I completely disagree with that.
Me
Now,
too.
there are a lot of studies, there are some studies that show that apologizing, and not even apologizing like, I did this and I'm so sorry, but apologizing in the sense of sitting down at the bedside with the patient and saying to them, I'm so sorry that this happened in your birth. I'm so sorry that you did not get the birthing experience that you hoped for. I am so sorry that you sustained this type of injury, or your baby sustained this type of injury. And instead of insurance companies and the system and the risk and the upper management teaching the providers this, instead they kind of say to them, well, don't say too much, don't say anything, you don't want to admit liability, you don't want to do that. But by apologizing or being empathetic, and empathy doesn't have to be just words, right? Empathy can also be your body language, how your tone, how you sit next to the patient. Like, you don't have to admit anything or any sort of liability by being empathetic to these patients. I mean, I can think of at least 3 people in the past 2 years that called me that genuinely were just left, felt abandoned, and had no answers. And I believe that had their doctors sit down with them and gone over, this is why we decided to do this, and unfortunately, this, all of these things, I don't think that they would have called me. I really, really don't. So I agree with you on that part of it. Secondary part, though, is I feel like there are some healthcare systems and some hospitals that kind of know we're probably not going to be sued for, violating a birth plan. We're probably not going to be sued for not necessarily being the warmest person, or even like consent issues, right? Of letting a
Wow.
patient birth. And I know I'm saying this and it sounds, but this is just my kind of thought process, right? Because here's the problem. Let's say a mom has a birth plan and she really wants to, push in different positions or not be hooked up to a monitor the entire time. And she's kind of bullied and pushed and coerced to birth on her back in a way that she does not want to, right? So let's say that that all happens to her. That's very traumatic. That's not legal in the sense of it's violating her consent, right? But let's say the baby's born and mom and baby don't have any injury other than the mom having this mental trauma, which you and I both know is significant. And she calls my office. I can't prove that having her birth on her back was below the standard of care or was negligent in order to bring a malpractice lawsuit. That's more a human rights violation. Okay. So it's not necessarily a malpractice violation where the insurance company that pays for the medical malpractice that's on the hook for those payments, the hospital's on the hook for those payments. It's not going to go down the route of a medical malpractice case. It's likely going to go down the route of, a potential human rights violation. And so,
Can you sue for that? Can you take
yeah,
someone to court? You can take a hospital or a doctor to court for violation.
for a human rights violation. But that being said, the finances or the financial, it's all, most of that is done through nonprofit work, nonprofit legal organizations that will do that because we don't get paid, plaintiffs' lawyers don't get paid unless we are successful in our claim. And if we're going down a route where we know the insurance is not going to kick in, or we know that it's not a malpractice case because we cannot prove that a reasonable doctor would not have done it in the same way, and we can't prove that there was any sort of physical injury to the child, we get thrown out of court. So
Mm.
they say, dismissed, you can't meet those elements. This is not a medical malpractice claim. This is something different. And unfortunately, I feel like the system knows that. They know that these cases really don't have a lot of financial risk to the hospital. So why put the money into training the staff in trauma informed ways and doing it in that way? Because when you're looking at negligence, it's from a legal perspective in medical malpractice. What I have to prove is I have to prove that the doctor fell below the standard of care for an average qualified obstetrician. So we're not entitled to good care. We're not entitled to nice care. We're not entitled to, yeah, we are entitled by law to what a reasonable acting obstetrician would have done in similar circumstances. So, I wouldn't be able to come in and say, well, a reasonable obstetrician wouldn't have had this mother, pushing on her back. I'm not going to find an expert. And that's the other thing. I can't just come in there and say that with all the evidence based literature that I have. I have to find another obstetrician that's willing to come in and say that. And, so we are already, the way that I kind of like to think about malpractice lawsuits for doctors versus patients is the doctor's on third base and we're in the dugout when we start, right? Because it's very difficult. Doctors don't want to testify against doctors. A lot of doctors have very strong opinions about medical malpractice cases. Again, because I think that there's a lot of misinformation about them out there and what catches their eye is the headline, the clickbaits, the high nuclear verdicts that we'll see, but that's not the everyday, right? That's not the everyday. And so I just feel like sometimes, you know, the hospitals know, well, there's really not that big of a financial risk here, or there's not that big of a liability, which is why I'm so glad to see, grassroots efforts to say, and even reports coming out like 1 in 4 women feel as though they've been mistreated in their maternity care. And, if we push and we say, we're not going to refer people to these hospitals anymore. We're not going to, you know, choose this hospital to give birth at. We're not going to support this hospital in this way because maybe they're not going to get sued, but they are a money making machine, and there are ways to say we're not going to stand for this and we deserve better care. But that's kind of, I think it's twofold. I think it's like you said, it could reduce them calling me, but I think the higher ups know the likelihood of a lawsuit on this issue probably isn't going to come into fruition.
I could just cry being so disappointed in the system, right? Like,
Yeah.
we are just asking you to keep us safe. That's really all we want. We're just asking you to treat us nicely when we come in there and just respect what we are asking. And you can't do that. And that it just like it literally breaks my heart. Obviously, some systems are better than other, and obviously there are really great doctors out there and it takes digging. But you would think that in a country the size and stature of the US, that we would just take better care of our women and children. You just would. So, yeah, that's super sad. It also is a bit offensive to me, and I'm actually not an easily offendable person, that the hospital thinks empathizing and apologizing to somebody is going to tip them off that the hospital did this, as if we don't already know. We're literally sitting in that postpartum bed being like, wow, this hospital messed me up. Like,
Yeah.
people already know it. So you might as well apologize and just say, look, we're really sorry this happened. We're so sorry that your birth took that turn. We this is what we did to try and prevent it. It didn't turn out that way. How can we support you going forward?
Yeah. And
That's
and
it.
that honestly, I don't think that opens them up to liability at all. But what has happened is in the past, so again, like I said from the beginning, right? They make statements and they put these ideas in their heads based off of past potential lawsuits, past litigation, all of these things. So what that means is that at some point, a doctor either wrote down incriminating information afterwards or made a statement afterwards to the patient. And I'm not saying that this hasn't happened multiple times, but and that was used against them in court, and the jury heard that, and the jury accepted that as an admission. Now, the interesting thing is, depending on what jurisdiction you're filing a medical malpractice lawsuit, some of that is inadmissible because that state wants to promote an open communication between the doctor and the provider. So, what I always say to providers is, well, what does your state say about apology laws? You can look that up. You can just Google, Massachusetts apology laws, or, Florida apology laws, admissibility of, statements after the fact, for medical malpractice lawsuits. And there are statutes that will exclude either an entire apology, a partial apology, or allow the entire apology in. So there are different states that have different laws about whether or not I, as a plaintiff's lawyer representing the patient, can come in court and say, on April 22nd, the doctor stated to the patient, or ask my witness on the stand, what did Dr. So and so tell you after your birth about what happened? And parts of that conversation will be excluded depending on what the state has for apology laws. So I think that's really where all of this confusion for providers comes from, to say, well, like, what can I say and how can I say it? And I think that's where hospitals are lacking with the training and the education for their providers that is going to offer better care for their patients, that's going to make their hospital a more desirable place to birth at, that's going to eventually end up in, more money for them, which is really what they
Why?
ultimately care about, right?
Yeah.
And the other thing is, especially in obstetrics, it's, we have the ability to train these providers on the ethics. We have the ability to proactively have trainings where we talk about common obstetrical ethical controversies or conversations or whatever you want to say, and we don't do that. So I always say, like, why don't we have every 6 months, why don't we have a medical ethicist come in and talk
Totally.
to the labor floor that says, this is what we're seeing in pregnant individuals across the country, right, where we know that these things are important to them, and that those things might make you uncomfortable. So let's talk about how we can reduce your uncomfort and talk about it ethically and legally to provide better care. But the problem is we do that kind of after the fact. It's
Mm.
more of a debriefing versus a proactive, and it's not going to help. The doctor's not going to pause in the middle of labor and call the medical ethicist that potentially the hospital has to say, oh, I'm in the middle of this, like, how should I handle this situation? But we know, based off, and I know, based off of the repeated things that we hear all the time, that these are common mistakes that are being made. These are common violations of consent that are being made and autonomy that are being made. And so if we know top 10 most likely ethical, situations that might be presented to you during labor and delivery, why can't we have trainings on this? Why can't we say, you're required to attend this once every 6 months, or even once a year would be better than nothing. But I just feel like there are so many other ways that we can be doing this at a cost effective, because everything's budget, everything's the training, it's the budget, it's the this, the that, because so much of my lawsuits come down to not somebody choosing, like a nurse not choosing to be careless or choosing to disregard their medical training. It's that they just are not supported and they're not being properly trained from the get-go, and they're understaffed, and then it's causing major severe catastrophic outcomes for their patients. So I just think there's so much that can be done here, and it seems a little obvious. I don't know, maybe it doesn't seem that
It
obvious,
feels
but
so
I'm
obvious
like,
to
hey,
me too.
let's just start. Let's start having the conversation before it happens.
Totally. It feels so obvious to me as well. You know, listeners, your doctor may not call an ethicist in the middle of your labor, but you have the right at any moment to say, actually, I'd like to get an ethicist in here. I'd like to have someone come in and be a third party that does not work on L&D and they don't work for me. And I'd like to have a conversation about my rights as a patient and
Yeah.
how we can help meet my I just learned this tip recently, so I wanted to pass it on to you. You can call an ethicist at any time in labor, and I have vivid memories of births that this would have been truly pivotal if I had known this little trick. So I wanted to pass on to you. All right, we keep hinting around like, all right, we're not getting lawsuits for putting people on their back and not letting them eat and telling them they can't get out of bed or breaking their waters, unnecessarily. What are we seeing lawsuits for if it's not for the things that feel violating to us?
Yeah, so most of the medical malpractice lawsuits surrounding obstetrics is catastrophic injuries to the baby or the mother, including HIE, brain injury, brachial plexus injury, an improperly monitored infection, uterine rupture, fetal monitoring. And I'm not just talking about with the TOCO, that's what we're seeing. And it's leaving either the mother, unfortunately, maternal mortality, the mother passes, the infant passes, or, there is a catastrophic either brain injury or something like that, sepsis that ultimately leads to death or brain injury. So that's really what we're seeing most. And that's what the litigation is really about in this world. And I think There are some lawyers that don't necessarily frequent birth injury that might pick up something else. But that's what the birth injury lawyers in our country are really focusing on: HIE, you know, again, brachial plexus injuries, infections that go on to sepsis, fetal and maternal death.
Yeah. Yeah, terrible things. Okay, and if we're not seeing providers lose their license for, you know, literally anything, I feel like I've never heard of a doctor losing their license. But what kind of things do doctors lose their license for if it's not for the things that again feel violating to us?
Yeah, so doctors, the medical board really, and what's kind of interesting is that you can go on your state's medical board website. So the registration of medicine in Massachusetts, you can go on there and you can actually pull up each month what they've made decisions on and their written decision on either reprimand, suspension, revocation, all of those things. And so that can sort of sometimes help alleviate some stress and fears that providers have when they go through and they read the opinions, because anybody who's practicing safe care will read these decisions and say, oh yeah, no, that's a
That's not
big
me.
no, right? That's
Well,
not
yeah,
me.
that's
I'm
not
not
me.
doing that. Like,
Yeah.
I don't have to worry about that. A lot of times it's mismanagement of narcotics and
Wow.
prescriptions, substance abuse with the provider themselves having substance abuse issues, fraud, insurance fraud, things of that nature. It's not just negligence. And in fact, in order for it to be negligence, it has to be repeated offenses to the point that they're all similar, that the doctor is making the same mistake over and over and over and over again in the same way, and that's going to lead to, gross negligence versus just negligence. So I just want to kind of clear up a couple of things. When we're filing a civil lawsuit for medical malpractice, our burden is to prove that the doctor was negligent. Now, negligent just means that they fell below the standard of care, that it's not intentional. It's more of, they were careless and it was an accident. It's not something that you have to prove at a very high standard. And the only award that's allowed is compensatory. So we get compensation for a medical malpractice lawsuit in the civil system. Okay, we're trying to make that person whole again, and the only way we can do that is by giving them money. Okay, I cannot ask within my medical malpractice lawsuit in a civil court that the doctor also lose his license.
Wow.
Okay, I don't have that option. The medical board can take away a doctor's license. So I can report the doctor to the medical board and report them with, the information based off of my civil lawsuit, but it's two separate actions. So that's kind of a important note, is that just because you file a medical malpractice lawsuit against a doctor, it does not mean that doctor is going to get reprimanded. It doesn't mean that the doctor is going to get suspended or that their license is going to get revoked. And in most 99.9% of the time, it won't even lead to a reprimand or suspension or revocation with the medical board. And so, a couple tips: definitely look up your doctor on the website, the Board of Registration in Massachusetts, and you can see, have they made any medical malpractice payouts in the past, 5 or 10 years. Now, if they've got one, I wouldn't be worried about it. But for example, I've sued the
Really?
same doc. Yeah, yeah. No, I honestly, I really, I know that sounds crazy, but as a lawyer, there are situations where it's not intentional. It was due to either a lack of training, or they made a mistake and it caused a injury. And that to me is not grounds for losing your license. It just isn't, in my opinion. And I don't think that that necessarily means that they're going to be a habitual offender in that sense. However, just to kind of highlight the fact that these doctors don't get their license revoked for medical malpractice lawsuits. There is a doctor in Massachusetts that works at one of the top hospitals in Boston, and I've sued that doctor 3 times. And if you pull up their medical on the medical board of registry, they've made 5 payments in the last 10 years, and they're still practicing at one of the top medical, you know, institutions in Boston. And we know that, some of the top institutions in Boston are also the top healthcare institutions across the country. So, but that's available information for you. So if you were to look up a provider and they have multiple payouts within the last 10 years, that's a signal that something is going on there for sure. And I would probably get a second opinion on that.
I interrupted you in your tips. What were your other tips to follow?
I don't remember what I said. So yeah, check out the Bill of Rights. Look up the Bill of Rights. Know your Bill of Rights. That's supposed to be posted in the hospital and the waiting room. You're supposed to be able to have that copy available to you. And the other tip that I have is, if you're feeling dismissed by your provider, make sure you're making a written note of that in your My Chart, right? So you want to be repeating to them in the message, like, hey, Dr. So and so, we had an appointment on this day. I expressed I or my baby was experiencing these symptoms. This was your response, and literally put their response in. I'm following up with you because I'm still concerned, and see what they have to say, because that makes it clear that it makes a few things clear. It makes it clear that you told them what you or your baby was experiencing for symptoms. It also makes it clear what their response was. And so then they have the opportunity to correct you on their response. They can say, oh, hey, actually, this wasn't what I meant. Maybe there was some miscommunication, and this is, what I meant, or whatever. It kind of locks them into whatever dismissive or kind of nonchalant response that they had to you. And that's not something that I feel has to be adversarial or has to be
Oh,
hostile, and I think that sometimes providers are very busy, they're rushed. Sometimes I don't think they're meaning to be dismissive. So by repeating to them what they said, and just by saying, like, okay, this was your recommendation, or this is what you said to the symptoms I'm experiencing. Did I hear you correctly? Is that what you meant? Or if they kind of rush you off because they don't have a lot of time, again, follow up in a My Chart. Say, my questions weren't really answered. I understand that you were busy. Can we have a televisit on this? Can you call me on this? Or can we schedule another appointment to fully discuss this one issue? So those are kind of my tips. Make sure that you're keeping notes. Another thing that kind of, unfortunately, sometimes I have situations of stillbirth and dismissal of the mother's concerns about the fetal movements, keeping an app tracker like Count the Kicks, so that what ends up happening is you get to know your baby's movements. And then what you have is you have kind of documented evidence to show. I know it sounds silly saying evidence, but you have something documented to show the doctor at the time of your prenatal appointment to say, I had told you that I was feeling decreased movement. Hey, take a look at the past 3 days, and this is what I've noticed. And that kind of helps them, okay, take it to the next step and not necessarily be so quick to dismiss you and send you on your way.
yeah. I interviewed someone from Counting the Kicks on episode 221 if you guys want to hear more about that. Marley, do you recommend doing this for kind of everything? And I agree that documenting things in your My Chart doesn't have to be adversarial. The language that you use can be really kind. It's literally just documentation. Your doctors and your nurses are documenting everything. We also recommend clients do this because this is your way of documenting things. But do you recommend we do it for kind of everything? Like, for example, hi, doctor. I just got home from my 39-week appointment. I saw you earlier today. I know your recommendation is this, and you really urged me to get a date on the calendar. I'm declining that because I believe in spontaneous labor. And right now, my baby and I are doing great. I wanted to just let you know my decision. Thanks, HeHe. Right?
I mean, I think it goes one of two ways. I mean, I think that that's fine, but I think it might, in something like that, it might pigeonhole you if the plan changes later on. And so, what I think is being very upfront and being very clear with your doctor about the way that you choose to birth, that you're declining an induction at this time, that should be in your medical record that you declined the induction because of this or that. So you can always check in your after visit notes on your my chart whether or not that's properly, documented from the visit. And if it's not, you can say, hey, I was looking at the my chart, I noticed that we missed that we had this conversation. But I just wouldn't want to have something that definitive kind of in there for that if the situation changes, right? Because they're making that determination on not wanting an induction at 39 weeks based off of the information that they had at that time and based off of how that patient was progressing at that time. And so I just wouldn't want then, if something changed, the doctor to then come back later on and say, well, we didn't even talk to her about the potential of a C-section because she made it so abundantly clear that that wasn't even on the table. And I have had situations like that happen. And it's like, well, no, now you're kind of,
Inferring
twisting
that,
the words.
yeah,
Exactly. Like
right.
you're inferring that just because at this one particular date she said this. And that's what happens in lawsuits. And it's sad to say, and it's why all of this is so complex. It's why this is also tricky. It's why a patient doesn't really think or a patient going in isn't thinking of all these things, right? Because they're like, why would I be thinking about filing a lawsuit, or why would I be thinking about worrying about a lawsuit at this time? But the hospitals and the doctors are, and that's always at the forefront of their mind. And so, you want to just make sure that you're just staying apprised of everything, and you're constantly, I think the most, and you do a really awesome job about this with your clients, is just making sure that the clients feel informed and asking the question again. You can ask the question 5 million times. Don't feel intimidated. Like, this is your health. This is your baby's health. There's nothing more important than your health physically and mentally and your baby's. So, don't feel pressured or feel as though because they're treating you in a certain way. Always get a second opinion as well. If for whatever reason early, I always say early and often, right? Early and often, make sure that you and your provider on the same page of all of those things that are important to you, so that if it is early and you're just kind of catching that vibe, you can make a switch if that option is available to you.
Yeah. Okay. Earlier, you talked about legally binding documents like the hospital policy is not. What about the consent form? Because our team is finding that a lot of places are going to electronic consent forms. You don't have it printed out. You're not able to edit it. A lot of times you can't even see the entire consent form and they just have you sign very quickly. Another thing that we know is very popular is, you come into labor, you're literally deep in labor. They shove a clipboard in your face and say, like, here, we need you to sign this. Same thing happens a lot with epidural. Same thing happens a lot with C-section. So talk to us about the legal ramifications of those consent forms. If we can't see them, if we can't edit them, can we ask to print them out? Can we get out of them? I mean, consent is a conversation and not just a paper, but I think oftentimes it's not presented like that.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. And legally it is as well. So I think that that's something to note. Like, legally, it's not just that piece of paper. So every single medical malpractice lawsuit that I file, there is a consent form within the medical record. The thing is, you cannot consent to negligence treatment. Okay.
Sure.
So it doesn't matter if they have listed every potential possible outcome on that consent form and you've signed that, you're not waiving your right to standard of care, proper medical treatment. You are not waiving your right. You're not saying that, yep, I'm consenting to negligent treatment. And so, therefore, if all of these things happen to me, I can't file a lawsuit. That's not what it is. And so I think that that's kind of presented in that way, like, oh, well, they have things like brain damage, they have things like maternal death, they have things like fetal death, all on the consent form. They have things like tears, they have things like prolapse. Like, I've seen all of those things on in consent forms. That doesn't mean that if the providers you know, were negligent in their treatment of you and it caused one of those complications, you can't file a lawsuit. You absolutely can. And again, like you said, was that consent form signed with the provider that's actually treating you, or was it online that they wanted you to sign before you even got to the hospital, on your my chart? Or was it something that a nurse provided you to sign? Who's responsible for the care, and what provider is responsible for the care? So for example, if we're talking about a vacuum, the use of a vacuum, if you consented to the use of the vacuum with somebody else, and then your provider comes in and doesn't properly consent you again for the use of that vacuum, and have the discussion with you before he or she uses the vacuum, it's a violation of your consent. It's
Wow.
it's an ongoing process. It's not a one-time piece of paper, and it's also limited in scope. Okay, so it can't be unlimited in scope, and it can't be unlimited in time. And I think that's something that is important to know as well. And again, we know that things change throughout the course. That's why legally it's an ongoing conversation, and consent is required for every single thing that they do, whether they want to admit it or not, whether they want to ask for it or not. It is required for every single medical procedure that they do on you.
Yeah, like individual procedures. So
Yep.
each individual cervical check, each
Yes.
individual thing that they want to do to your baby, every single time they take your blood pressure, they should be saying, "Is it okay if I take your blood pressure? Do you have any
Yes.
questions about it? It's exactly what I did 20 minutes ago or an hour
Yep.
ago or whatever." Okay, so we talked about a little bit about, the insurance companies really scare all these doctors. And for me, I saw very clearly in my brain the trickle down effect. The insurance scares the doctors, and then the doctors say fear based, scary things to the patients, and then the patients make these decisions out of fear. Talk to us a little bit about our birth plans, because you have made a post before about, like, can your birth plan be held against you? And I'd love to hear that trickle down effect in regards to a birth plan. And are they actually a helpful tool? Are there things we need to put on our birth plan, leave off our birth plan, say about our birth plan in order to actually use it as the communication tool that it is? So in the birth lounge and in Tranquility by HeHe, we use as a communication tool and not an actual plan, because you're not gonna be able to plan out birth. So it's really just a list of your preferences. If we're in this situation, here's what I'd like to do. If we're facing this decision, here is my preference. But please always check in with me to make sure things haven't changed. What do we need to know about patients and consumers in our birth plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think one, that yes, your birth plan can come into evidence in a lawsuit. So that's number one. In a lawsuit, if you file a lawsuit against your provider, they legally have a right to obtain any sort of relevant discovery, any relevant documents, text messages, phone
Wow.
calls, photographs, birth photographs that you've taken, text messages with your doula, yeah, things like that. So those are requested. And we ask the same things of the doctor. We ask for audit trails. We ask for communications that they've had throughout, with whether it be with other providers, or, emails, or whatever it might be. We ask for all that information, but it's a two-way street. And so I just kind of always caution, just remember, if you're sending a text message, specifically really like after the birth, just be careful at how you're wording it. I would always just recommend having a telephone call with your doula versus going in through, because again, things are taken word for word sometimes, and that's not necessarily, they're taken out of context. Well, yeah, but you didn't have the full picture. You read one text message, you didn't read the whole string, or you weren't, so I just caution, because it is potentially going to be submitted to the other side, so the hospital or the doctor or whomever it is that you're suing. So that's number one. Number two, I just think that a birth plan should be flexible, so that you're not limiting yourself to, or you're not limiting yourself for the further conversations, the consent, if things change, what or whatnot. I don't think it's a black and white, leave this on and take that off. I mean, I think that it shouldn't be 10 pages long. I think it should have the most important aspects of it and be flexible in that sense. And I think that you should talk about your birth plan really early on and then also ask, okay, what other providers are within this practice that might be delivering my baby so that I can talk to them also with my birth about my birth plan because we have situations where either the doctor on the floor is just the one and you've never seen that person, or maybe it's another provider in the practice and you didn't get the chance to meet them prenatally. That way, everybody's kind of on the same page. And if they give any pushback, you can always just say, well, the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology has a birth plan on their website. Like they recommend this is not a problem. This is, my right and what have you. So because I do also see judgment just off the bat, just from the fact that there's a birth plan. I mean, they don't even like the word plan on it. They want, other terminology for it because it somehow freaks them out so much. But yeah, so that's what I always say to the doctors, like, hey, if there's something wackadoodie on the birth plan and something goes awry, hey, you've got that birth plan and you're more than welcome if you get sued to take that birth plan out and say, hey, see right here, this, completely out of the world request. Oh yeah. So I just think that, just knowing that and doctors knowing that too, it's like there shouldn't be this big of a hubbub over it.
Yeah, the animosity is really weird, and listeners, I just have to be honest with you. I'm always going to be honest with you, even if it's not what you want to hear. If your doctor's putting up a big old fight about a birth plan, the fight that you're going to encounter in birth is going to be 10 times that. So you should really think about changing providers. Even if you love them, you can always come back to them after you have your baby, but you need somebody that's going to be a little bit more aligned with you. Okay, Marley, what is up with doctors perpetuating the idea that, oh, if you leave or if you leave AMA or if you don't do this, your insurance is not going to pay?
Oh, that's just not true. I mean, that's just absolutely not true. You're not that I have not seen that once in the past 10 years, and they do not actually. And I feel as though doctors that are perpetuating that, I mean, they're committing fraud. I mean, that's
Oh,
not,
wow. Yeah.
it's just not true. Hospitals, insurance companies pay for that. And we see that the most in emergency rooms. So we see that most as far as people leaving against AMA, against medical advice in emergency rooms. And you hear that the most in emergency rooms from doctors, like your insurance isn't going to pay for this visit, and they do. And I can put the link. I can send you the link to that because there's an article that kind of looked at that to see if insurance companies actually followed through with that.
Yeah. Wow, that's crazy. We don't hear that often, but when we do, I'm always just like, wow, that so misinformed individual. I'm so sad that you are still believing this. And sometimes I really do believe that they believe it. Like I can just see it in their eyes where they're like, "Oh my god, but your insurance is not going to pay for this." And I'm like, "I don't have the time to educate you right now, but client, let's go." When this is not true. Like,
Yeah, I mean, I think, and again, I think that, social media can be great. It can also be not so great. And I think sometimes what happens is there's like very polarizing extremes on social media in some way or shape or form. And
always
despite,
clickable. People
yeah,
love to do the clickable things.
yeah, but despite the fact that I've been in this kind of world seeing atrocities, I do think that there are more good providers out there than bad. I do believe that they want to make a change overall, and I think that there are a lot of bad apples, but I do think that sometimes they get the biggest hype, and then it's tough because then it kind of or erodes this patient doctor relationship that is so integral and so important, and the most important, I feel like, for a positive experience. So I don't know. I'm a little cynical. I have been jaded by this work, but I do believe that there are more good than bad out there for sure.
Yeah, I do too. I think sometimes that you have to dig for them, and I think you have to recognize your own self-worth. You have to recognize what's bad care and what is care that you actually deserve, and you have to seek that out. And I have a separate podcast called the Pulse Check podcast, and we actually dive into how the system really just beats up our doctors and our nurses, and even the ones that are truly in it for the most golden reasons. I mean, literally just the purest of hearts. They get beaten down and they're so misused. They're overworked and understaffed, and just, I mean, they're abused by the system too. So it's multifaceted, but I agree with you. Okay, Marley, my last question for you is, how can doctors and patients work together to help move the needle forward in bettering our birth care and our maternity care in our country? Just maybe two or three tips of, like, all right, I'm going to go into this birth, and from a doctor's perspective and a patient's perspective, here are the things I'm going to strive to do because I want to better our birth world.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the answer is probably unfortunately, I feel like the healthcare system and the doctors have a lot more work to do. And I almost and the reason I say that is because we see so many campaigns about self-advocacy, and we see so many campaigns about what the patient should be doing, and the patient and the patient and the patient. And that's true.
Hey,
And that's great, but that's not going to solve the problem of what is happening with our maternity care in our country. And so I would love to see more initiatives from hospitals specifically saying, this is the information that we have about the maternal care in our country. These are the individual steps that we are taking as a hospital, as a practice, as a clinic, or whatever it is, to mitigate these outcomes, right? That's what I want to see. I feel like I see a lot of statements, like hospital statements, but there's no plans. There's no step by step
where's
action
your
to,
action?
and so that really bugs me so bad because I'm like, it doesn't matter if you agree or you don't agree with it. And it doesn't matter if you get on a soapbox and you can go on the website and say, we denounce this or we denounce that, and this is our statement. It's really like, well, what are you doing from the ground up to change these experiences? Are you having trainings available to your providers for multiple things? I mean, some of the things that I hear in deposition from residents about the type of training that they're receiving in OB residency is so mind-boggling to me.
On,
And
like,
they're
a
not,
disturbing level, like, you're disturbed by, like, "Oh my god,
yes,
it's terrible," or you're disturbed by, like, "Oh my god, they're just, like, not getting adequate training."
yes, that they're not getting adequate training.
Mm,
There never should be a situation ever where I'm asking a board certified doctor something about evidence-based medicine, and they're giving me the wrong information based off of my questions. I'm not a medical doctor, right? I get all of my I'm not an obstetrician. I've read a lot, I've done a lot, all of that stuff. But like, if I'm asking you a question and you can't answer my question with evidence-based responses, that's a problem. And you should not be, and that's why you're in this situation, right? That's why I'm asking you these questions.
that's why
Like,
you're
you know what
sitting
I mean?
here,
I
my friend.
feel like saying that. I'm like, holy cow. But it also just goes to show, like, it's really sad to me. Like, sometimes I end a deposition and I feel really, really bad because it's so obvious that this person, the system failed this person, that they did not get the appropriate training, that they didn't have enough support. So, what are we doing? What are these individual hospitals doing? And, ACOG as an organization, what are you doing on the ground? You are the largest organization of all of the obstetricians in our country. You have the most influence on guidelines and policies and how we should be treating our pregnant patients. Where is the step by step action plan, and how are you going across the country to make sure that these obstetricians are following this? Where is it? I just want to know. We see the statistics all the time on the headlines, and then it's really sad to me because then you look back 20, 24 years, and the statistics were really still the same. So this isn't anything new. And if we wanted to have changed it, I feel like we would have
Could have.
already.
Oh my God.
And so I just wonder, I would love ACOG to come out and say, this is unacceptable. And this is what we're doing. And this is what we're requiring to, if you want to be a part, if you want to be a member of ACOG, you want to pay us your dues and you want to be a member of ACOG, these are the things that we require, and something, anything, because that organization, it's all I hear in the depositions at trial. It's like, well, ACOG says this and ACOG says that. And I'm like, okay, well, if ACOG is the one that is making all of these guidelines for 60,000 plus obstetricians in our country, and everybody is aware of the problem, where are they? How do they fit into this crisis? Let's stop putting it so much on the patient, because that's wonderful, but there is so many times where you can't advocate for yourself in these positions. And so self-advocacy is great. Knowing, warning signs is great. Those are critical, absolutely. But it's not going to fix the problem as a whole. And so that's really what I would want to see.
Sure. It's just not enough, right? Like
Yeah,
with ACOG, I feel like we've been long calling ACOG to the stand, to the podium to say, give us something because we have nothing right now, right? Just
yeah,
give us a little something to help us out, to move the needle forward, to protect women and children in birth. Because, like you said, you are the voice, you are the guiding light for so many obstetricians. And a lot of people depend on ACOG, me being one of them. Our practice is
sure.
heavily rooted in what ACOG recommends. And yeah, I agree. I agree. Marlie, this has been fantastic. This honestly has been more than I could have ever imagined for this conversation. I think that you do a really beautiful job of laying these things out in a way that's digestible and actionable, and it makes people feel like they have a voice and that you have a place that you can go if you were mistreated to see, is there something else that you can do? Is there better support out there? Are there other things that you can take up to help you on your healing process? If people wanted to reach out to you, if they thought they needed your help, if they just wanted to share something with you, if they want to follow along on social media, how can they do that and where can they connect with you?
Sure. So my office is based in Newton, Massachusetts. I take clients and associate with attorneys all across the country. So feel free to reach out. Even if you're not in Massachusetts, I can help you and put you in good hands with an attorney outside of the state. But you can find me at Birth Injury Law on Instagram. That's my handle. Or you can go to my website, which is lerowillerlaw.com. But honestly, just follow me on Instagram and send me a DM if you're interested in chatting, and I can send you the link to my calendar. And yeah, I mean, doing these podcasts is really trying to shine the light on, the flaws in the judicial system, and also, some of the myths out there, so that providers and patients can be working better together without the fear of the scary word, lawsuit.
Yeah, that's my dream because I do know that a lot of gaps in care happen from fear. And it's like, you're almost like two batteries that are resisting each other when you both come to it with fear, where we could be attracting like the best providers. So, Marlie, truly thank you so much. Listeners, connect with Marlie on social media. As always, you can find me at Tranquility by HeHe on all platforms, and on Instagram, I'm the.birth.lounge. I hope that none of you ever need Marlie, but unfortunately, I know that is not the truth. And I know there are a lot of people out there who could use her support and her wisdom. So connect with her there, and I will see you guys in the next episode. Bye, y'all.
Bye.
Thanks for joining us. I'll see you next time on the Birth Lounge podcast. Until then, head over to Instagram and find us at Tranquility by HeHe and give us a follow. You can also check us out at thebirthlounge.com.